Give me money, give me money, give me money, give me money, give me money.
My adoration of Adagio Dazzle has been thoroughly documented over the years, almost as much as my passionate hatred of O.C. McNotice-Me. And it seems that despite my constant baying at the moon about how redemption arcs are played out and overdone, there's always that one asshole who asks, "Would you want Adagio to get a redemption?" No. No, I wouldn't. That would be completely terrible and strip away everything that makes Adagio fun. And here's why. Adagio Dazzle was the very definition of tough act to follow, so much so that Hasbro hasn't actually tried to follow it. Ever since Rainbow Rocks, Hasbro's completely abandoned the very concept of villains. Every antagonist in the show and film so far has been some variation of a character being corrupted by magic, or a character experiencing minor hardship and having a complete and total mental breakdown into homicidal rage. Or in the case of Stygian, both. Gloriosa Daisy was the only occasion where the new model for villains actually worked, primarily by not making the event that drove her to villainy something that was laughably trivial. It was freaky when I realized this too. Like, I had to go back over release dates to make sure that I hadn't missed something, but it's true. Rainbow Rocks came after Twilight's Kingdom, and then the Cutie map immediately followed, and that was the point where this one aspect of the series took a massive nosedive. But Adagio wasn't just the swan song for villains in My Little Pony, she was also wholly unique on her own. She was a malevolent force like most of the villains up to that point, but she wasn't motivated by bitterness, responsibility, principle, or laughs like the others were. The Sirens never ruled Equestria, they just swooped in, caused a disturbance, soaked up the magic, and left. She abides by none of the traditional Saturday morning cartoon villain tropes. More specifically, she's not a plotter in the traditional sense. A common trend for people who are trying really hard to avoid all-devouring evil villains is to hyperinflate the need for planning. It's right up there with Tragic Past on the list of overused tropes by insecure dicks. There's this big, masterfully laid out plan that's been so meticulously documented that it would take a flowchart to explain the whole thing. Adagio, on the other hand, doesn't do this. In fact, her entire run as a villain is reactive. Something happens, she observes it, and then immediately capitalizes on it. She sees the main six defeat Sunset in the distance, recognizes it as equestrian magic, and then immediately makes moves to investigate. She learns that Canterlot High has a musical showcase planned and capitalizes on the opportunity to use their powers to nudge the school into a competitive mindset. The main six make a laughably bad attempt to friendship their way out of the situation, and she takes advantage of it to play up the crowd even more and exploiting the main six's overconfidence into an advantage for herself. Adagio Dazzle does not plan. She watches. She waits for others to make a move and then thinks about how she can capitalize on your mistakes. She's patient and moves as you do, steadily closing off your avenues of escape with every step.
She's a predator.
This isn't planning or guile, it's opportunism, something that is often mistakenly associated with planning or guile by the same people who think sympathetic villains are automatically good because thinking is hard. So why is this so good? Well, aside from the fact that it's unique in the face of increasing homogenization of the cast, Adagio Dazzle is not a character in her own right. She's an obstacle for the protagonist to overcome. Despite her uniqueness and departure from traditional villainy tropes, she's simultaneously the most traditional villain that Friendship is Magic has ever had. You see, in traditional storytelling, the focus is on the protagonist, the hero. They're going on their own journey with their own arc, and the villain is ultimately a culmination of that arc. Villains are plot devices more than anything else. This is why many traditional villains are often rather bare bones in design. They're designed with their purpose in the story in mind. Motivations, backstory, personality, insecurities, none of these things exist in these villains because they're not important. Adagio is no exception. For all her opportunistic villainy, Adagio is rather short on personality. Almost everything she does or expresses is a facade to keep up her goals. Some people have tried to pin an individualist philosophy on her based on the lyrics of Battle of the Bands, but this is just bullshit she pulls out of her ass to fuel a competitive and hostile instinct within the students of Canterlot High. This isn't bad design, it's good design because Adagio has all the characterization and design she needs to be an effective villain. The story isn't about her, it's about Sunset. You see, since 2010, there's been this push for villains to be more involved in the story, often to the point of supplanting the protagonists. People assume that this is always better because it means the villains can be more fleshed out, but the key word there is can. One of the biggest problems with discourse surrounding modern cartoons is to just assume that because something can potentially be more enriching, then it must always be so. The Legend of Korra is praised among a lot of people because the villains are more involved with the story than Fire Lord Ozai was. Some people praise Starlight Glimmer as Friendship is Magic's best villain because she kinda has a point. But where this idea falls flat is that it's prioritizing intent over execution. Intent is important, but intent largely ends where execution begins, and this is the part that tends to trip people up. On Sketchy's October roundup for Season 7 of Friendship is Magic, there's no shortage of people arguing with his reading of Shadowplay on the basis that the Pillars and Stygian were both supposed to be at fault. Now, that's the intent. But in execution, Stygian went behind people's back without a significantly acceptable reason for doing so, and so the argument of, well, they didn't respect me is met with, tough shit, asshole. Arguing intent is fallacious because nobody sets out to make a bad story. Bad stories are always the result of someone trying to make a good story and failing, which means execution overwrites intent. As I've said in several different videos, it doesn't matter what you meant to do, what matters is what you did. While more involved villains can make a story more enriching, the standards for writing that villain rise accordingly, which means you need to stick the landing with that character because they are effectively your new protagonist. You have to write on a completely different level than you would with traditional Doomsday villains, and a lot of writers actually fail to stick that landing. They can potentially be the best villains ever made, but they have just as much potential to be the worst villains in a story if the writer fails to pull it off. Where The Legend of Korra fails is that it chickens out most of the time. The villain that might have had a point is a liar, or is possessed by darkness, or is a literal Nazi, or just flat out didn't have a point to begin with because explosions. Friendship is Magic has a similar problem in that they just take traditional villains like King Somber or Queen Chrysalis, staple a kinda sad backstory to them, and call it a day. This new kind of villain raises the bar, and the writers consistently fail to deliver. With traditional villains, you don't have that problem because the focus is on the protagonist. They're the ones that need to be well written, and the majority of writers in the industry are more proficient at writing straight up protagonists than they are at writing sympathetic villains. With the traditional method, even if your villains have design issues, which in Friendship is Magic's case is all of them, it has less of a negative impact on the story because they are in fact a plot device at the end of the day. They're a challenge to be overcome. And Adagio pulls that off extremely well. She's ultimately a test of Sunset's sincerity above anything else. Nobody was buying her redemption at the end of Equestria Girls, and the Sirens exist to put more and more pressure on her. They don't need strong characterization, and in the absence of needing that, they can put on more of a show. Moments that would otherwise be taken up by character establishing scenes are instead devoted to jokes and otherwise fun and witty dialogue. This is the only reason that Sonata and Arya are even in the movie. They only exist to be a source of frustration and annoyance for Adagio and behave more like her bratty daughters than actual partners or even henchwomen. Almost everything that Sonata does that turns into a meme is written with the express purpose of making Adagio miserable because that's funny. They're a marked upgrade of Snips and Snails from the previous film because they're a laugh riot to have on screen. I'm looking for a single word to describe the Sirens, one that's been lost to the discourse about animation being award-worthy. What was that word? Oh yeah, fun. You remember fun, right, Megan? Right? Do ya? Megan, please stop kissing your Starlight pillow. It's very unbecoming. Some people, wrong people, saw that one scene where Arya briefly suggests that she be the leader as a story thread that the movie completely abandons. These are people who forget that immediately after Arya suggests it, Adagio grabs her by the neck and reasserts her dominance, and Arya's face clearly says, "I'd better stop this line of thinking before I actually die," and then proceeds to sulk while Sonata laughs at her. That's a funny scene, and it's done a disservice by people complaining that it doesn't lead into the Sirens becoming, well, Starlight. Some people ask if I want Adagio to come back and get a redemption, and I've always said no to both. The Sirens coming back would only lead to their inevitable woobification, and that saps away all the things that made them fun. People want their favorite villains to get redemptions because it means more of them, and that's all they care about. They don't really think about all the work it takes to put a character in that position. Adagio was not designed with redemption in mind. Her characterization is largely performative, and she has little time spent on developing a three-dimensional personality. She was made specifically to be the old school kind of villain. Bringing her back for a redemption would require completely redesigning her to fit that role, and doing that is likely to erase the things that made her so enjoyable to begin with. It won't be the same character, and it won't be as fun, and this is even putting aside Friendship is Magic binging on this topic to begin with. Some people bring up Zuko as a prime example of how redemption can work out extremely well, but what they don't notice is that Zuko was designed designed with a redemption arc in mind right from the word go. He wasn't a fan favorite character that was brought back with a redemption arc hastily thrown in, and the rest of the villains in The Last Airbender are just straight up villains and characterized much differently from Zuko. This is because they weren't supposed to get redemption arcs, so they were written with that lack of redemption in mind. It would only be a disservice to try and force one onto them. It's like putting diesel fuel into a non-diesel engine. It's just gonna fuck everything up because that engine wasn't designed for it, and you're just gonna be left with a massive paperweight where your car used to be. That's my writing and critical theory lesson for today. Characters are written with their intended roles in mind, and trying to take them out of that role and into a completely different one requires massive redesigns to everything from their mannerisms to their appearance to even their entire personality. And doing that is likely to lose what made that character memorable to begin with. And everyone's favorite "well, actually" argument only proves my point. Reforming Adagio would be to make Adagio nice. And nice Adagio isn't fun. Adagio was fun specifically because she was a predator. And you can't combine nice and predator. Well, okay, you can, but doing so would require the writers to contend with the fact that they spent the last 4 years encouraging children to talk to strangers, and we all know they're not going to do that.